Good morning, and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Giede, and today we will be speaking with the Honorable Jay Hill of the Maverick Party in the second half. And for the first half, we'll be taking your comments, questions, and concerns, some interaction again, kind of an opening statement here, on the census, and what does that mean to you? Remember to like and subscribe to the Western Standard on Facebook as well as YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe to us on the site. We don't get any government dollars. This isn't the CBC. So if you enjoy our content, well, please support us. My opening statement. The census arrived at my door the other day. In fact, while my beloved and I were on our way back from our very important, totally necessary, essential travel on the weekend, we noticed that someone had dropped off a cream-colored item at the family cabin, despite the fact that it's not a real residence. Apparently, even counting people in order to tax them can be a wasteful government exercise. We need to understand that, as the Bible tells us, that's what a census really is about. All the way back to the birth of Christ and long before, governments have herded and lined up those they rule, counted them, and then asked them for their money at the edge of a sword. You cannot squeeze your citizens for cash without counting your citizens and all of their private property. There's a catch-22 here for many people, particularly those right of center. For the high-born and money, the census is an opportunity not only to brag about their own wealth, but also to leverage the capital of the country to continue building the empire. After all, there's no way to speculate on houses or land or infrastructure if you don't know where the demographics are heading, where the future is for your country. We remember this about the CPR. There was a huge problem with the CPR because as soon as anybody knew where the rail line was going, all the land around it immediately fell into speculation and huge costs were incurred. For the lower classes, especially anyone attempting to live independently of the state, the idea that the government knows who you are and what you are worth is terrifying, and rightfully so. Best understood by pro-gun advocates, they only count your stuff or yourself in order to tax or apprehend you later. All government numbering is to be treated with a deep, cynical suspicion by this particular mentality, but from this perspective. The left has their own versions of these privacy questions, and perhaps we'll talk to them about it tomorrow when we have Stuart Parker on and Aaron Ekman on. But for now, let us puzzle out just a little of the conundrum at hand. If we don't count people or their stuff, we won't know how many more roads or schools or sewers to build. But every time we do count them, the state's power is increased and can be abused. Concept I've had to explain to many people, actually, particularly my own fellow Catholics, because usually, as we all know, people who are Roman Catholic often vote liberal, or at least in this country, and are usually pro-state. Sometimes they're pro-life and pro-state, which is always a bit odd, but that's what I'm getting to here, is the fact that the state is not our friend. Indeed, the secular state was founded in order to resist the morality of any church or divinity, that it would be so large and brutal that it could act in its own interest with impunity. And we need to understand that, particularly with the West, but any state authority, was always self-interested and was always violent, and it always used coercion to get its way. So there isn't an idea here somehow that there's a moral authority within the state. The state acts in its own interest, and it acts with it without asking forgiveness for anybody else. And this has been proven in history many times. Just look around the world today and tell me I'm wrong. Look at what's happening with the Drogan. Look what's happening to the poor, Kurds in northern Iraq. Look what's happening with the coup over in East Asia. This is a reality. We know this. People fight for control of the state because it has such powerful coercive powers. But we live in a society which requires cooperation and planning on such a massive scale that we need some kind of read on where people are at. For anybody who's listening to me in Alberta and might take a more reactionary stance to the census, just think for a moment, what would you feel like if we didn't survey the land that we were going to build a pipeline on? So if we didn't know if there were sinkholes, we didn't know if there was soft ground, we didn't know that there were swamps and whatever else, if we didn't know that the ground and the bedrock was there and it was capable of supporting a pipeline, capable of supporting the weight, and then if something were to go wrong, that we'd be able to clean it up and it wouldn't just drift away, you wouldn't want to live next to that thing. You wouldn't want to live there. And so the same thing here. Without the census, how are we supposed to know where the country is headed? It's a hard question. So we must have a sense of where we're going, which is what the census gives us. That's way too many sense words in one sentence. At the same time, I wrote it, so it doesn't matter. I just have to criticize myself. At the same time, it becomes easy for the government to abuse such information. How do we fix this situation? Perhaps all we need to do is give the census to municipalities, which is where the numbers matter most. So that's my opening statement. And this is going to definitely be a pretty comment-heavy kind of day, I think, because there's a bunch of things when it comes to these questions. Cody is right there at the very beginning again. Registration always leads to confiscation. That's why I plan on having home births and not giving my kids SIN numbers. This is a serious debate, though, at a certain level, right? Because the problem is, as soon as you assign a number to anything, as soon as you're in somebody's book somewhere, right? As soon as you've been noted, you are at the mercy of whoever made that note, right? Because if they have coercive power, what are you going to do about it? Especially if they have the entire power of the state at their back. This is an old problem. It's an old problem, and I mean, for me, I usually use biblical allusions about this because there's a couple of different moments actually. There's a census in the Bible. It's called the Book of Numbers. People forget that, but it numbers all the tribes and all the peoples and all the stuff and what was happening at that time. So there's literally a census in the Bible, in all canons, everybody's canon, it's in there, and then of course we all know that the Christmas story. Well, the Christmas story begins with literally Joseph and Mary having to go to Bethlehem because that's Joseph's hometown in order to be numbered for the census. So like from the beginning of time, as far as the Judeo-Christian history is concerned, that's there. And then we have kind of two parallels actually, again, that we get from a biblical allusion, which is Samuel and Christ. So you get Samuel saying that if you have a king over you, he will dominate you, he will put your sons into his armies, he'll take your daughters for his harem and for his wine girls and everything else. And he's going to tax all your stuff, he's going to take your best stuff for himself and aggrandize himself, and then he will coerce you into wars and put you into poverty and abuse you. And that's what he says. That's essentially him describing the state, right? He's talking about the king, but what did Louis, is it Louis the 16th, the 17th, the Sun King, what did Louis say, right, just before the revolution took his head? I am the state, right? So the embodiment of the state, the embodiment of government in the sovereign, right, that was what Samuel was pointing to there and saying, look, he will be the manifestation of all that is wrong with power and coercion and everything else. And then we get to the New Testament. The New Testament says kind of the same thing to a certain point, but says, but we still have to live in this society, so render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. I'm not just talking about those things because I'm some kind of Bible thumper or something. I'm talking about those things because they're real allusions that have a deep belonging, especially for those of us right of center, but they have a clear sense. If we get into modern political theory, right, the idea was that absolute monarchy corrupted absolutely, but that was, interestingly enough, that was a result of the nation state, not a beforehand thing. So if you go to the pre-modern era, so about 5 minutes before the Reformation starts, what you have are all these little dukedoms and little kingdoms, little princelings. There's no real solid single states. They're starting to move that way, but even France, we have to remember that 13th century France is like 3/4 or less the size it is today. England owned a third of France at the time, right? Through Henry the Fifth or Fourth, I think. But the point is that all these different things, the Henry who was in charge during Thomas Becket, when the whole thing with Thomas Becket happened, whom Trump recognized, bizarrely enough, in December, just before he left office. But the point is that the nation state is kind of where it all starts. Okay, it all starts with the nation state. So the idea that we're not going to have belonging based on a kind of universal morality or calling and something that transcends tribalism. We're going to build our tribes bigger, right? And so we're going to be Burgons, and we're going to be French, and we're going to be Basques, and all these kind of things are going to come together, and we're going to have Spain, we're going to have France, we're going to have England, we're going to have Germany. Germany got very late in the game, obviously. It didn't form until 1871. But all these pieces are going to come together, and the nation state is what's going to project power into the world. And then that's going to be embodied first in a sovereign, right, with absolute monarchy, then in a kind of oligopoly with a sort of selected Senate and or upper house and lower house, because there weren't true elections until quite a bit later in the 18th century. Finally get the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and you get the state as kind of supposedly the vox populi, that it's a voice of the people. And then we get into our own modern era. Now, what am I talking about here? What does this have to do with anything, right? The point that I'm trying to draw here is that state authority, government power, it requires being able to kind of number people, right? It requires when you take numbers of things and know where stuff is at. You have to know how many people there are, and you have to know what their stuff is worth so that you can tax them in order to supposedly build the infrastructure that will allow for more people and more private property. That's the theory. That's the theory behind the census. I have questions about this because I'm fairly certain, well, I know for a fact, I'm fairly certain that the government is definitely giving our information to entities that are less than perfect. They take our census, they take our numbers, they see who we are, they know who we are, and then they give that information or they reveal it to people who would use it for their own ends. And of course that has to do with marketing, and it has to do with the way capitalism works and that sort of thing. That's to be understood. As soon as somebody's making notes of you, right, you are the product. If the product is free, you are the item that's being sold, right? We know this about social media. We're streaming to social media right now, and we don't pay for this stream, right? You can stream to YouTube and to Facebook as long as you hit enough subscribers and that sort of thing. That means that we're selling something somewhere. Somewhere there's an ad out there. Somewhere there's somebody who's making money off of this, and it's not me. When it comes to that direct sort of correlation, right? I'm the product, and somebody's making, or at least the producer of the product, and somebody's making that off my labor. So the point is that, some ulterior entity out there in the Facebook, YouTube world, the social media world. And the point that I'm trying to draw here, I suppose, is that when it comes to building up our future, the future of our country and that sort of thing, we need to know where we're headed. We do have to make notes, right? We can't, if I have to build a school down the road here, I'm up here in BC's northern capital. I live in a place that's called College Heights. It's kind of the ritzier part of town. I don't live in a ritzy place up here, but this is definitely, it's considered the wealthier part of town. It's kind of almost its own town because Prince George was built in layers. So speaking of the census, Prince George was built so badly, it was badly surveyed, and it didn't combine the towns together properly that College Heights, essentially, especially because it doesn't even have a branch of the library, it feels very left out by the municipal government. It raises a lot of taxes because there's a lot of nice property here, but it doesn't really get a ton of services outside of garbage and everything. And so it doesn't have a pool, doesn't have a library. And so the point is that people up here kind of like that they're the big box store suburb because they were the last suburb to be built. And they like being the big box store suburb because then they never have to go into town, right? And Costco's at the bottom of the hill. So the thing is that demographically speaking, a certain kind of person lives up here because they don't have to deal with the rest of Prince George. They have no need to deal with the rest of Prince George. They never need to leave here. They have a big box. They have big box stores. They have a few little shops as well, and then they have, of course, they have Costco not far away. And so the point that I'm trying to draw here is that every single section, at least of the Northern Capital, really, really, really builds on what was built there before. And if we don't know where we're going, then we can't build accordingly, right? So if I was in charge, if I suddenly became the civil engineer of College Heights and I was about to go and build a school or whatever, I would need to know how many children are being born around here. I need to know that, right? Because I can't build a school. If I build a school too big, then I'm going to pay for heating bills and that sort of thing for the next 30 years for the lifespan of the school, 30, 50, depends on how long you build it for. I guess even 100 years for some schools. But the point is that from day one till day end, when they tear it down, I'm going to pay X number of dollars in both the mortgage that it costs and the materials, and then the ongoing costs of operation. Right? Let alone the renovations and the pipes that are going to burst and things that are going to have to be fixed, right? Like wear and tear, right? So if I build something smaller, it's going to be less wear and tear and less costs. But if it's too small, then I got to start building portables, and then I got to start appropriating new land, and then someone's going to start screaming at me because I didn't build a big enough space. So in order to build that space properly, I need to know how many people live in this area, how many children they're having, what is the likelihood of this place being full, and then how much overcapacity do I want? Do I want 5, 10, even 15% overcapacity, or do I want to keep it super tight and basically be like, no, it's for the 100 children that I know are going to be born and raised and then brought through this school through the next 10 years. That's who it's for. Those 100, 200, 300, 400 children. That's who it's for. It's like, well, what happens if we get a population, pump and we're in your 5, 10, 20% behind? It's like, well, don't care. Like I've just built it for these 500 kids. If 700 kids show up, those 200 other kids either got to go in the portable or they got to be put into a different school and shipped there and bused there, right? Well, that's going to cost the census. Is that we understand that we need the information. Again, totally acknowledging, both the comment that was made. Registration always leads to confiscation, and of course, apparently, outside with James there a little bit earlier, comply with nothing. I appreciate the sentiment. I don't know how valid it is, but yeah, Cody again. Basically, census is necessary. We just have to figure out a way the government can't explain, which is the case with everything. No, that's correct. And that's kind of what we're not arguing. We're discussing it this morning, right? We're discussing it here. Just a second. We're discussing it this morning. And so the way that I would pivot this is let's acknowledge that we need to know how many people are there. You do a head count every time you take you and your wife and your kids into the car and go somewhere. Especially if you have more than 2 kids, you got to actually kind of keep an eye on what's going on out there. And if you get into the big, I know some really big families through my church, like literally 9 kids. You need to count, and if you don't count, you're going to leave somebody behind. So if we do that in our personal lives, how much more so in our public lives and in our policy lives? Okay, so we're all on the same page here. You need to count people. How do we keep the government from abusing the people it's counting and their stuff? I think the simplest way to do that, this was Harper's solution. This is actually probably what I'm going to write my column on this week. If you go around Prince George, there are actually still stop signs up everywhere that have the Harper underneath, right? Stop Harper. And you're sitting there and you're like, Harper hasn't been in charge we're going to get on to a decade pretty quick here. It's not going to be that long, especially if the Liberals win again. If the Liberals win another mandate, it will be a decade. Especially this fall, right? It'll be 4 years, right? So if he lost in 2015, then it'll be 2025 by the time the legacy of Harper will be 10 years gone. And that usually is how it goes in Canada, is we have about 10-year cycles when it comes to our politicians. So what happened was I was driving around town and I could see all these Stop Harper signs that were still up. And it just kind of occurred to me that a lot of Harper's legacy has already been undone. So, congratulations, you did stop Harper. And also, what's the point of still keeping these up here? As if Stephen Harper was the boogeyman. He wasn't even much of a boogeyman while he was in there. A lot of us who are more right of center, more right-wing than that government was, we had a lot of questions about that government. They did some austerity stuff. They lost a bunch of votes. They closed a bunch of lighthouses, which was the bureaucrats who did that to them. And they managed to lose government, that didn't work out for them. If there's one thing I probably would have objected to the most out of that government in things that got closed, I think the veterans' offices was one, because that was just a way to lose votes. I have no idea. You got zero gain. You saved pennies on the dollar. Nothing really changed, and you managed to lose a huge amount of votes by closing the veterans' office. That was a waste of time. But the kind of most eccentric one was probably those. I think there was rehabilitative prison farms. So places where people who are non-violent offenders or less violent offenders, whatever it was, people need to be rehabilitated who had gone through the penal system. They got to be on these working farms. Now, let's be clear. I hope they made a decent wage, because you shouldn't make prisoners work without being paid. That would be called slavery. So that's not okay. So we don't believe in slavery. But the thing is that this rehabilitative situation where people are being taught how to get back into society, and maybe they're being taught it by learning some work ethic on a farm, whatever, that's great. And of course, they're contributing to society in that way. That got closed, I'm pretty sure. Somebody told me about this a few years back, and I remember that a buddy of mine, who's actually a member of Parliament now, was his cousin twice removed on his mom's side or whatever, was out there with a sign, It's kind of different politics. My buddy's a Tory through and through, and his cousin, I guess, kind of a libertarian lefty sort of thing. But he's out there with a sandwich board sign, just like, stop it! Like we gotta save these farms and whatever. And I kind of sympathize with that. Like we should have saved the farms. Again, what did we gain by cutting the farms? I don't know. Probably some corporation bought the land and I don't know, started farming marijuana. Waste of time, in my opinion. But the Stop Harper thing, it's funny because Harper tried to get rid of the long-form census. And we all remember, it's funny because we're here 5 years later, right? So in 2016, they quickly reimposed the census. They rushed. They went really fast, and they reimposed the census. And it was all rush job. And I remember there being some weird questions in it and everything like that. Funnily enough, that was the last time my producer and I were living together. We were just happened to be in PG at the same time, and we were hanging out and whatever. And this was actually, that was 5 years ago, was when this show was being discussed, actually. But the thing that hit home with the census is that it almost got killed. It almost died off. Harper almost ended it. And then, of course, it was reimposed very quickly. My answer would have been, if I had Stephen Harper's ear, or he said, you are now the czar of the census, you figure out what to do with the census, is I would have gone to the municipalities. So I would have gone to the unions of municipalities, the various unions of municipalities that are throughout Canada regionally. I would have met with lots of mayors and lots of regional district people. I would have been like, look, like the federal government shouldn't be doing the census, or it can help pay for the census. It can even print it off for you or something. But you guys should do the census, and the information is actually most relevant to you. This is something that really, really bothers me when it comes to the left. The left makes every single issue that ought to be a local issue into a national issue, and then they expect everybody to pay for it. Garbage, recycling, sewers, water treatment, like all that stuff is really a local question or even a provincial question. But then they always try and find federal mandates for it. Heck, affordable childcare. Do it in a town, man. Like, take over a town's council, put on 2% onto the sales tax, the merchant tax of your town, or up the gas tax or something. I guess you have to call the feds about that. But whatever. The point is, up the sales tax or find some way of appropriating the money and run a model, affordable child care system using the money that you have appropriated. Like, it's not hard. Don't try and make a national child care strategy. Do a local child care strategy and then see if that's a model for the national one. If you do the national one, you're going to impose something on everyone, and it could be a really big problem. A really big problem. So let's take a step back here. Harper kills off the long-form census, which in a way was almost a problem because he, instead of shaping it into something new, he was essentially leaving a vacuum. And this is actually a free piece of advice to conservatives everywhere. Never leave a vacuum. Never leave a vacuum. The lesson that the left has taught us over the years is that if you leave a vacuum, someone will fill it. Someone will fill it. I would argue actually that even on a morality side, what's gone wrong with so many things, especially when it's like, well, we're trying to teach children to not, look at terrible pictures on the internet or have good self-image and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, the issue is that if you don't tell them that, they're divinely inspired, handwork, artisan, dignified soul made by God, then you're just telling them, well, don't do bad things. You're not telling them you are a beautiful creature and you deserve respect and honor and dignity. You're telling them, well, just don't do bad stuff. So you have to tell people, you have to give somebody something to fight for, not just something to fight against, right? And so the same thing here with conservatism. Rah, 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 we're gonna stop the census. It's like, okay, I get it that it's an invasion of privacy. I get that it's a problem. I get that it's a huge expenditure of money. And I get that the government's clearly selling our information to their crony friends. Totally agree with you. But if you just cut the census, your enemies will reimpose it and reimpose it worse, right? And we see this with all of Harper's legacy. It was all cut, not a redirection of how things could go. And it wasn't enough of a cut to be like, if you had just cut the CBC and held his ground for 4 years, maybe they would have brought back the CBC, but it would have been at a far reduced capacity because even the Liberals aren't so generous of heart that they would have given every single old CBC person their job back. They would have shuffled some people out, and that would have been the end of that. So So if you're going to do the cut thing, you actually have to make it extreme enough that, like, it is like losing a limb, and you learn to live differently. Like, you have to live differently as a people, as a group, as a nation. So that's how extreme it has to be. You can't do little things. You have to be. It has to be like, nope. People literally have to learn to live without there being a CBC. It isn't on the radio. It isn't on the internet. It isn't anywhere. It doesn't exist anymore. And people learn to live without it long enough that they're like, oh, I forgot that existed. That's method one, if you're going to do that. Method two is that you redirect things and you create your own narrative. And so if there had needed to be cuts in certain places, or if there needed to be a rejigging of things, then you create your own narrative and you explain it differently, right? So like the Liberals make it sound like they invented healthcare. They didn't invent healthcare. Tommy Douglas invented the idea of a national healthcare plan after imposing it inside of Saskatchewan, and he needed both the Tories and the Liberals to vote with him, which they did in order to get that done. So, because it was a minority government, I believe, or at least between minority governments, between Diefenbaker's end and Pearson's beginning. So the point that I'm trying to explain here is that conservatives have to shape the narrative. If they don't shape the narrative, they're just leaving a gigantic vacuum, and the left will fill it. The left is full of great storytellers. You know why a lot of my friends were left-wing throughout, even in university, going to a place like Trinity Western that was at the time very, very religious and very kind of straight and narrow. Rigorous, very rigorous. It wasn't fundamentalist, but it was definitely right of center, and it was definitely religious. You know, it was full of social conservatives. But there were a decent amount of social liberals in there too, and various liberals of all kinds. But, you know, they stay up late. You know, they have a few too many, and they share their, you know, pack of darts with you, and you get a good conversation. You know, and sometimes us conservatives, we head to bed, you know, on time, which is good. It's good to go to bed on time. But if you're not there for that conversation, then you're going to miss it. And that's not a universal, it's kind of a bad analogy, but it's kind of the same thing. If you aren't there to shape the narrative, someone else is going to shape it for you. You have to get ahead of the story. You have to impose your own narrative, or someone will dictate it for you on your behalf. And I promise you, it won't be charitable to you. It's going to be charitable to them. So, what does this have to do with anything? It has to do with the census. When Harper cut the census, he made a mistake by just leaving it as a vacuum. What he should have done is gone to the municipalities and said to them, hey, let's get this going. Let's find a way to help you guys do the census. Let's find a way to have you guys understand where the new sewer is going to go, where the new street's going to go, where the new school's going to go. Right? All the federal and provincial governments need to know up top, really, is like, well, where's this highway going to go? Obviously, it's going to go down the easiest path that we can do, and especially if we're twinning the highway and we're finally getting away from these single-lane roads. We have all these single-lane roads in BC. If I'm envious of anything from you guys from Alberta, if I'm envious of anything, one, I never got to make any money off the oil bump, and I think I'm a fiscal conservative enough that I wouldn't have gotten caught out with a whole bunch of payments. I think I would have just bought things cash and been okay. No offense to the people who did get caught out. I'm sorry that happened to you. But number two, the thing that hits me is that I love the Alberta highways. Okay, Alberta highways are beautiful. They're beautiful. You guys have spent a huge amount of money on them, and your modern cities, like at least with Calgary especially, the on-ramps, the off-ramps, the overpasses, you guys are brilliant. Okay, that's beautiful stuff. That's what should be happening in BC. Instead, in BC, yes, we've twinned a couple of our highways here and there. We have some four-laners, but for the most part, we have these stupid little single-lane highways that are very dangerous because obviously oncoming traffic and head-on collisions are totally possible. And furthermore, they go right through the middle of town. They go through the middle of towns. Like they don't not bypass the town. I don't want the town to die because it gets no foot traffic, but it should be an on-ramp and an off-ramp. It should be I'm getting off of the highway and into this town, or I'm not. And I can just carry on instead of hitting 15 lights every time I go through a town in British Columbia. It's just silly. So that's got to change in BC. What you guys got going on in Alberta, that's brilliant that you guys have made so many on-ramps and off-ramps and that sort of thing. I love your highways. But the thing is that we need some kind of counting to know where those highways are going to go. Those highways in BC aren't going to get built without knowing how many people are moving up there and how many people are going here, how many people are going there. And so we need to know that. But that would have been my answer. Let's go back to the people. We'll go back to the municipalities, and we'll talk to them about, hey, what's going on? What's going on? We need to know how many people are living here. You need to know how many people are living here. Let's find a way to gather that information in a way that respects privacy and respects private property, but does count the people so that we don't build a school that's for 100 kids when 700 kids were born this year. That's a waste of time. And here in Prince George, we've had a couple of problems with that. I don't know how it's going in the rest of the province, but here in Prince George, there's been a couple of moments now. There's a couple of high schools that have just been rebuilt. My old high school got rebuilt not that long ago, and Kelly Road is getting rebuilt right now, and they're having to overcompensate with Kelly Road because my old high school, Duchess Park, was built too small. So somebody took the wrong census data. This is the other thing about counting people. It's like maybe you should go with your gut. If you actually see a lot of kids running around on whatever Aboriginal Day is called nowadays, or Canada Day, or BC Day, or whatever, you're out there in the park on a nice day and you're seeing a whole bunch of children, maybe think to yourself the school shouldn't be smaller. Maybe it should be at least the same size, if not bigger. And overbuilding is always better than underbuilding. I understand the ongoing operating costs. We don't want to build 8-lane highways in northern British Columbia, okay? We don't need 8-lane highways. We do need maybe finally 4-lane highways and divided highways in a way to make sure people aren't hitting each other oncoming traffic. But we don't need 8-lane highways, okay? We don't. Made of concrete all the way up and down north. Be clear, if that's what we spend our money on, that would be awesome, because I'd love an 8-lane highway made of pure concrete that, took me all the way to Tuktoyaktuk, and I could just rip on my motorbike all the way there and back. That'd be great. But I understand that's unfeasible. So, but we need to, if we do need to overbuild things, we do need to overbuild our infrastructure when it comes to the soft stuff like schools and that sort of thing. And we can't be not taking the data seriously. And so if you take the data badly, like what happened with my old school, where they built it too small. And of course, it was all nice. It was all very nice. So everybody wanted to get into that catchment to go there, right? And but it was what it was. We're gonna bring up this comment by Cody again. I'm not just trying to play favorites here. Cody's got some good points though. Decentralize the census information somehow so it's not compiled. Have civilian oversight, and necessary info is passed on to each sector that needs it. That's again valid points. I mean, these are all kind of commonsensical things. Like it's not. This isn't rocket science. It's very simple. Help the government know where to build the stuff without compromising the integrity of the people it's building for. Right? It's not. This isn't rocket science. Actually, it's interesting here. Julie's got a point here with Prince George. It's our roads need some TLC, I think is what this comment says. Yeah, our roads in Prince George need some TLC. Yes, they do. But there's a municipal problem that we can get into. Maybe actually something that we could get into a little bit here is that, or rather, there could be comments, questions, concerns. Again, we always try to throw up my email address to try and make sure that people can contact me with any guests they'd like on, and to know that people, do send me things, send me items, send me news items, send me your stories, and we'll see what we can do. I don't know if we're going to do an outright fan mail side of this show. I've never really done that. You have to remember, I'm as new at this as you are. I've been in broadcasting a long time, but that was all recorded, and even what was live was just an interview with somebody, right, or a bunch of panelists. There wasn't a personality and people interaction, right, or a consumer and personality interaction, or any of that. I'm not saying I'm some great star. I'm just saying, like, I've just never done this before, and so it's a bit of a learning curve for me. So again, if you can be patient, do send me stuff. Let me know who you want on the show. Let me know what kind of topics you want addressed. Saw a lot of comments in there again about the vaccine. So I want to do an update on that. The person who's close to me is still not feeling well and is struggling and is having problems. Clearly has a blood clot. I think a blood clot in the lung. So that's not good, in case anybody was unsure of that. Blood clot, lungs, not good. And it's funny. Well, that's not funny at all. But I mean, it's interesting that now that I'm telling people about it, people are telling me that actually, a lot of people who are taking the AstraZeneca are not doing well, or had to lie low for a couple of days, really got wiped out by it. So I don't really, I want to be clear. I've not changed my position. I never wanted to take the vaccine. The moment I heard there was going to be a vaccine, I didn't want to take it. I guess I'm one of those odd people who did really respect how fast Trump managed to get that out there, because I was a big fan of the former president, President Emeritus, I believe you would say. But nonetheless, we don't need to get into that here. But nonetheless, the point is that I was never in favor of taking the vaccine myself. I was fine with other people taking it if they wanted to, but I think it would be in bad conscience, wouldn't be in good conscience if I didn't tell the truth around this, which is, as far as I can tell, that vaccine is not going well for people, and people need to be aware of that. That I've kind of seen it in my own life, somebody who's close to me, someone who's a family member, and that's that's pretty rough stuff. We don't want that for anybody. You don't want that for your worst enemy, and people shouldn't have that happen to them. I think that actually something that's kind of interesting is the vaccine does kind of loop into this census question a little bit, in the sense that, again, how hard is it to get a bunch of guys into a truck, load up everything in the back there, make sure you have all of your equipment, and then go off to wherever you got to go and start delivering the vaccine, regardless of what one thinks about the vaccine. Like, how hard could that be? I'm not saying that it's nothing. I'm not saying that it wouldn't take effort, and you got to feed those guys and house them somewhere. And, if it's the Army doing the vaccinations, that's a huge part of the United States version, I think, is that the Army's helping with the vaccination, the armed forces. In Canada, I think it's just mostly healthcare professionals. But even so, right, it's just, we have these people, we need to get them into this vehicle, and then in the vehicle is going to be the vaccines, and we got to get somewhere. And I think what it ties into, again, is kind of logistics. And maybe that's what's kind of the story of Canada. If there's a material story of Canada, it is that we had to overcome the craziest things in the world to make our country. Okay? We don't understand this. Okay, we don't understand this. America is a dreamboat. Okay, America is the absolute dreamboat at prom and whatever. That's what she is, because America is just made up of things that there's a reason they wrote poems about her, like she was the promised land. The Mississippi is such a slight grade over such a long distance that it facilitated more trade than some rivers in Europe had for thousands of years. In 500 years, the United States did more trade on the Mississippi than some other places had done for thousands of years on their rivers, because their rivers weren't as good as the Mississippi. Canada doesn't have a Mississippi. Okay, the closest we have is kind of some of our prairie rivers, and even though some of those grades are pretty nasty, and there's rapids, like they still have hydro in Manitoba. How do they have hydro in Manitoba? It's flat. No, it's not. It's not flat enough. They have hydro. So Canada just doesn't have that legacy like the United States does. It just doesn't. It doesn't have the beautiful New England, the Middle Eastern, that doesn't sound right. It doesn't have the states that are below New England into the eastern seaboard, and then into the south with the Appalachians and the Carolinas, and then the deep south with the Baton Rouge and all the rest of it, and the Creole, and then up the Mississippi, through the Midwest with the breadbasket, and then finally into the Rockies, and then into the gold of California. It doesn't have those things. And when they built their railroad, in America, it was infinitely easier than it was in Canada. Canada had to build the St. Lawrence Seaway, infinitely harder than the little Hudson locks that are on the Hudson River into the Great Lakes. We had to deal with the Canadian Shield when we were building the railway, getting out of Ontario, southern Ontario, through the rest of Ontario, which at that point wasn't Ontario, it was Rupert's Land, and then all the way out to the prairies. And then, of course, our Rockies were harder than their Rockies. We've all heard that story from our childhood when they were talking about how many trains it took to get up and down the Rockies. What am I talking about this for? I'm talking about this for because with the census, with the vaccine, and then with Canada's kind of history up until basically 1967, until our centennial, logistics were a thing we could do. We used to have an aircraft carrier. We had a very large Navy after the war. We were capable of building pipelines and capable of building roads and all this stuff. And I think with the vaccine is it's endemic. It's a pandemic of endemics. we do have pandemics of endemics. There's all these little endemics, these little endemic signs that Canada is falling apart. It's not just sovereignty. It's not just separation. It's not just people being angry at Trudeau. It's not just, roadblocks going up on whether it's going into a reserve or onto a rail line. It's not just the violence that's happening between different peoples, different kinds of peoples, different backgrounds of peoples. Those are all pieces of it. But something deeper than all that is that y'all got to live on the street, right? You all have to live on a street. You all have to drive to work or walk your kids to school or whatever, right? There's this central belonging, right? There's this piece of infrastructure. It's where your garbage gets picked up. It's where you take your cows when you're going to the meat market. It's what brings you your oil and gas. Like this road, right? A road, an airport, a port, right? These things symbolize that we are all connected in one way or another. No matter how much you might not like your neighbor, we're all connected. And we have to be connected. And in this country, you would starve to death in a matter of minutes if you didn't have your supply chains. Right? I lived at the end of one of those supply chains. I know what it's like to have spoiled milk arrive and that sort of thing. Churchill was a long ways away from where the fresh stuff was. Cost of food was exorbitant, and you could see how bad it was when you live at the end of a supply chain, far away from where the stuff was packaged, far away from where that chicken was finally put into a freezer or something. It's a long way to go. And the vaccine and the census and these logistical things, they all tie together in a sense that Canada is falling apart. We weren't able to get the vaccine out. We weren't able to do a plan. We weren't able to figure this out. We don't even have vaccine facilities in Canada anymore. We don't build any pharmaceuticals here. We don't manufacture any pharmaceuticals here. What are we doing? What are we doing? I've told you before on this show, I'm kind of a soft sovereignist on this question. I'm more interested in Canada working better than splitting it apart just because we're mad. That doesn't mean we don't have a right to be mad, but we do need Ottawa to give us the autonomy to do what we need to do, and we need to fight for our rights. How to fight for those is still a debate for me. I'm still questioning which way to do that. A lot of it for me at this point is very much like we need to find a way forward through the First Nations people. That seems to be the only vehicle that the Supreme Court respects, and even Ottawa actually has to give some credence to. So that's kind of where my lines are starting to draw. But that's a different question for another time. The issue at hand is that Canada is falling apart. And the vaccine and the census, as well as our inability to build a pipeline or to get projects done on time and on budget, all of it is tied up in the same thing, which is a fundamental lack of confidence in the country, a lack of communication, a lack of cooperation. That's what's going on there. And until that changes, until there's just a change at the deepest level of our hearts and our souls, where it's like, no, I want Canada to be a better place, and I'm willing to make the sacrifices to get it there. And most importantly, of course, our leaders making that sacrifice and being willing to do that. Until that happens, we are in a very dangerous place. Very dangerous. This country could fall apart tomorrow, certainly. In many ways, it already has. And so that's what touches me about this question of how do we move forward as a country? How do we do this? And the thing that hits me is like, well, I think that we do need to kind of rejig what the census is doing, and we need to start bringing things back to the local level. A fundamental idea inside of the beliefs I hold, which are actually mostly religious beliefs, is the idea that you leave decisions with the lowest possible common denominator, the most local thing. Right. So and that's for everything pretty much. I mean, there's some practical reasons that maybe you'd want provincial licensing rather than local licensing when it comes to driving or something. But pretty much everything else, there's a lot of things that need to be done at a local level. And at a certain way, why couldn't it be locally licensed if Ontario can respect a driver's license from BC, why can't a license that was handed out in the Prince George district? The other day we brought up that image of where the travel bans were And if you saw BC, you saw how it was cut up into all of its health regions. Well, I don't like the health region borders necessarily. I have my own borders I prefer. But imagine if it was the health regions, if that was the way that all of our provinces were redivided. So we'd have probably 5 times the provinces we do. It would almost be like the states. Have like 50 provinces. Well, why not? Why not? And there would be poorer provinces, and there would be richer provinces. But the richer ones would also be this big, and they have to spend their money somewhere. They don't want to just live in Toronto. They don't want to just live in Vancouver. They want to go places. Well, you're leaving the province of Greater Vancouver, and you are entering the province of Hope Kamloops, or whatever. However you want to put that. The Thompson River province, whatever. Thompson River. Fraser Thompson. You go wander around in there. You camp around in there. You spend your money there. Why can't your driver's license from Vancouver qualify in Thompson River? Why not? And vice versa, right? Like, this happens in 50 United States. It happens in all the little states that are inside of Germany, inside of Europe. All of Europe has transferable driver's license. So breaking things down into very, very small parts when they're still inside of kind of a loosely confederated entity, that doesn't mean that you're going to lose all your rights. It doesn't have to mean that at all. It's a choice by people. That's the thing about government. It's a choice by people. How we choose to act is what the government manifests as. And maybe that's kind of the place to sort of bring it all together, is to say, well, whether we're looking at the vaccines, again, regardless of your desire to take it, whether we're looking at the vaccine, whether we're looking at the census, or we're looking at infrastructure, or we're looking at poverty reduction, it doesn't matter. There are all these problems that plague Canada. All of Canada, the Kingdom of Canada, right? The Dominion of Canada. And I would hope that all of Canada could solve those problems, but we might have to solve them together alone, in a sense, with our local communities. It can't just be the 10 premiers plus the Prime Minister and then the 3 guys from the territories. It can't be even just our Western premiers coming together and solving this problem. It might need to be broken down to the point where, I guess this is the problem. If I'm a sovereignist, I'm a sovereignist that's a sovereignist of my town and my region. I don't know how to stand in solidarity perfectly with the idea of all of Western Canada leaving Ottawa, but I do know how to get like even my small area to leave Victoria, or at least that I could reason through that, at least to tell Victoria to get out of our lives. I'm sure that there are many people in Alberta that could feel the same way. This is the thing about sovereignty is that there's a real danger that places like Calgary and Edmonton, I prefer to call it Redmonton, start running the show, right? So as if rural people in Alberta don't already feel left out, the same as us in BC. And I'm not trying to denigrate anyone that lives in Edmonton or in Calgary. I'm just saying that, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and right now people in rural Alberta and a lot of people in suburban Alberta all feel that the government's not listening to them, and that they want out. They want to do something different. Well, what happens as soon as you get what be careful what you wish for, right? So you get what you wished for. Okay. What next? Now Calgary is the power center and Canmore is not. So how's Canmore and Calgary? How are they going to battle it out to decide who's in charge and what's going to happen next? And, what if the Canmore people don't want all the Calgary people to come and move in there, and then they got to fight about that? It's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing. So with Canada, all I know is that we are facing some serious issues. Right now, we're literally looking at a vaccine rollout that's been completely botched up. We're looking at the census that, I'm interested to see what kind of questions are on it this year, especially in light of COVID and everything else. I'm gonna do some bits on that tomorrow. I just opened the package today, so I'm gonna do some bits on it tomorrow after I complete the package and at least look through the questions. And then, and I'm gonna write on it this week, I think, as well. But yeah, again, the census, the logistics, the vaccine. This country has lost confidence in itself. The separation, the sovereignists, the mistreatment of the West by the Trudeau government, mistreatment of everybody by the Trudeau government. I mean, the Trudeau government's abusing this entire country. I think Central Canadians are actually getting just as abused by the Trudeau government, but it just looks nicer, just looks prettier, but it's not. Huge protest in Quebec the other day, I think, for no more lockdowns and the curfews and the masks and everything. It's just nonsense. And I think that people are finally starting to snap under this. But the question is, where to from here? I mean, we're not America. We don't really have a legacy like America does, throwing off its fetters and getting all hoorah about what they're going to do. And we have to kind of acknowledge that, I mean, for myself, I'm still a monarchist. And it's a hard thing to kind of reconcile. Like, so where to from here? What to from here? What does it look like? What does it mean? We need a vision for the country. And that comes all the way back to the Stephen Harper thing. What was Harper's greatest sin? No offense to Harper himself, is a lack of vision for the country, or not communicating that vision very well. And when he failed to do that, he left a big vacuum. This country had been ruled by the Liberal Party for years. And he had a chance while they were in third place to basically censor them, not censor them and then like ban them, but just be a bully a bit and bully them around a bit. It's like, nope, you've had the run of the place for a century. You ruined it. I'm going to push you around. I'm going to denigrate you. I'm going to make everybody know, be ashamed to have anything to do with you, the same way you do to us. And you deserve it. You deserve it for the way that you've run this country and the way you've hurt this country and the people you've hurt. So bleep, bleep you. And he had a chance to reform Canada and say, this is what we're doing. This is who we are. This is where Canada is going. And it wasn't clear. It wasn't clear. And that vacuum allowed the Liberals to slither back in the way they always do. That's how it is. So if you don't create a narrative, if you don't cleave to a certain set of values, and if you don't clarify what those values are, you are in deep, deep trouble. Deep, deep trouble. And that's exactly what's going to happen if you don't create that. So the census, it's an opportunity to recreate the narrative and to redirect it and be like, no, you know what? Canada from now on is going to be a loosely confederated entity where the municipalities and the regions and the local regional districts and that sort of thing, and farm councils and little unincorporated entities where everybody meets in the basement of the church or in the post office or whatever at Bob's place, and we have a barbecue in the middle of summer. That's the town council meeting. That sort of thing. Because those are the people who built this country. Like, let's be clear about that. Like, let's get excited about this. Those are the people who built the country. People who are not, I mean, it was the 19th century, so they weren't illiterate or whatever, but like there were some pretty illiterate people. But by the sweat of their brow and the blood of the toil and in the soil and the perseverance they had with their families, like they built this country. The farms we have in the prairies, the railroad we have connecting it, the highways we have connecting it, the mines, the portages, right? The ports, the airports, the battles we fought overseas. All of that came from real people doing real things that were very, very hard and very, very tough. And some of the rights that were won along the way. We can be those people again, but we have to have the tools to do it. And the tools are not a whole bunch of centralized authority way over somewhere that you can't even see. It's all centralized. You don't even know who's in charge. The expertise is way beyond you. Language doesn't make sense. It doesn't touch base with you. You don't have any grasp of what's going on because it's not human and it's not real and it doesn't hit you the way that a real thing would. It's all like the COVID thing. It's all a bit of a lie. We're all faking it. We're all participating in it because we have to. They called the Soviet Union Empire of Lies. Soviet Union had a lot of departments, a department of everything, from female fertility all the way to what fur coats should be sold in Russia because certain mink had to be a certain grade. Like, it doesn't matter. Ministries of Interior, ministries of safety, everybody had some kind of ministry somewhere. There's a lot of government in Mother Russia during the Soviet Union. The entire Soviet Union, the USSR, was a hugely bureaucratic system. Well, we have a lot of bureaucracy today, and COVIDism is making for even more bureaucracy and technocracy and distance between people and people not feeling like they have a connection. We have to change that, and people are snapping under the strain. And I, for one, am glad. Like, I don't want anyone to snap and go crazy and do something violent, but I, for one, am glad that people are finally waking up and saying no, and they're waking up to the fact that government doesn't always have the answer. That's really important. It doesn't. They're fallible human beings, just like everybody else. And there's only one way forward. And that's to give each other some respect and to trust that your neighbor might know what's best for his own kids, and his own family and his own job, his own life, and his own work. And we have to work together to bring the power back to the people. That's what we have to do. We're a couple minutes away here, hopefully, from Jay Hill logging on with us. We're going to be talking with him about a couple of different things. Do bring it up in the comments, anything you'd like me to ask Jay about the Maverick Party and what's happening there. A funny story, Jay was actually my member of parliament because I lived in the northern part of Prince George. We can bring up, I guess, maybe the long title. I don't want to get it wrong. I think it was a different name when he was there. I think the name changed under Bob Zimmer, who's still the member who succeeded Jay Hill. So the district used to be called Prince George Peace River, and of course now it's called Prince George Peace River Northern Rockies or something. It's called something insane. It's like the longest one out of all. I think it's the longest one out of all of the districts. Yeah, Prince George Peace River Northern Rockies. Yeah, it's got a lot of letters, and I don't know if there's a longer one than that, but there's definitely something somewhere that's pretty long. And so Bob Zimmer, he's the member for that district now, but Jay Hill was the member of that district for, oh God, how long was he? He was with the class of 93, right? So he was there till what, 2000 and something, 2010. Yep. I tried to help one of his buddies. Not one of his buddies. Sorry, I tried to help one of our buddies succeed him in that seat. He didn't win that seat ultimately, but actually no, that was a different seat, wasn't it? Yeah, it was Todd's seat. Never mind. I'm getting all my wires crossed. I'm sorry. But the point is that Jay was my member for a long time. Him and Dick Harris. I think Jay Hill stuck around in Canada, which is great, and I think Dick Harris went off to Arizona or something. He's living the snowbird life far away, somewhere warm. Or maybe it was the southern Okanagan. Either way, I kind of treat those two places the same. I'm not saying that I don't love my fellow British Columbians, but I cannot be bothered with the sunshine tax. I can't do it. It's a beautiful place to visit. I just visited it. It was wonderful to be there with my beloved. She was looking great. I was looking great on the boat. It's all fun times. But, man, you couldn't pay me to live there. That's a lot of money. Too much money. But love you, southeastern BC. Love you very much. Sorry. Didn't mean to throw you guys under the bus like that. Call it the Sun Belt. We call it the sun tax for a reason. And it is not cheap down there. But, hey, there's peaches that grow on the trees. Those are really good. No, so we're just hoping that Jay will be here in a couple of minutes. Again, comments, send anything my way that you would like me to talk to him about. And if you're ever wondering, like, my monitor is over here, so that's why I'm kind of always glancing over there to see what's going on. That's where if my producer brings something up for me to read, that's where I'm looking, and of course that's where my opening statement is. So again, one of these days we're going to take the camera and we're going to move it around and we'll give you guys a kind of a tour of what's going on. Maybe we'll pre-record that and you guys will kind of get a view of what's happening in the studio here. I think you guys are going to be kind of amazed at how these smoke and mirrors work. It's kind of funny. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's worth getting into right now because Jay's supposed to be here in a few seconds, but we have several lights. Of course, that's the key, right? And with the lights, as soon as you have your lights going, right, then you need the soft lights, you need the harsh lights, right? And the big thing actually is behind us. If you're looking past me here, you'll actually just see a light. I'm hiding it, but if you look past me here, there is actually a green screen. So this is what's actually behind us. That's how things work in the movie world and in the TV world. And so you just impose an image. And the key with the image, so the reason that there is this light behind me that you can see there, and then there's a couple of lights, there's a light this way and there's a light that way. The reason that exists is that without enough light casting, right, you have to basically take all the shadows off the back. So that's what all the lighting is for on a stage or something like that, or a sound stage, or a stage that's doing even a play, right? All that lighting is so that the shadows are cast as you want. If they're not cast the right way, then all of this would look really messed up. Even so, right? I mean, you can kind of see it's a bit fuzzy here, but that's fine. We have a great camera, thanks to some generous donors. But other than that, we have all these kind of smoke and mirror sort of items we have here, and it's kind of interesting. I've never really done it this way before. Again, the broadcasting I mostly did was in the radio. I did that I still do it. Every Friday I help with the local radio station, community radio station. I have four guys on there, but we'll pivot here pretty quickly. We're gonna go straight into our time with Jay Hill, the Honorable Jay Hill, to be clear. Jay Hill joins me this hour to talk about the Maverick Party and to discuss the upcoming election. Jay, can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Loud and clear.
Perfect. Well, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on, and I'm just super excited to hear about this new party and what we're trying to do to make the West's voice heard.
Well, I'm very pleased to be on the program. Getting a lot of feedback.
Yeah, it might be the microphone versus the speakers on your computer. Maybe that might be what it is, but. So maybe bring down the volume on your computer a little bit. It might go a little smoother. The best way forward here, I think, is for you to just tell me how it is. What's happening with the Maverick Party? How did we all get started here? And then what do you think is going to happen with the election? Just go, Jay. Just go.
Well, thanks, Nathan. I'm gonna have to turn the volume all the way down. We'll see what happens here. Can you still hear me okay?
Absolutely, yep.
We'll try that. Really what happens is, I think, similar to what a lot of Westerners experienced following the 2019 election, when Prime Minister Trudeau got reelected, albeit with a minority instead of his majority. And what we saw was that there was a huge increase in interest in the West charting its own course. And manifested itself by people responding to a sort of a call to arms by Wexit movement. Of course, that stands for West Exit, and it's a play on the term out of Britain with Brexit out of the European Common Market. I obviously as well was attracted to that, despite my former life originally as a reformer, then Canadian Alliance Member of Parliament, and ultimately a Conservative Party Member of Parliament, Nathan. And I ended my career, as most people now know, sitting in Prime Minister Harper's cabinet, and resigned, or what I thought was resigned from public life in 2010. And after the when it was so clear, I think, to the vast majority of Westerners that our current Prime Minister was the most unqualified, unprincipled, unfit individual to ever occupy the Prime Minister's office. And yet Central and Eastern Canadians, for whatever reasons, re-elected him. And there was just this sense of betrayal, as I say, on the part of most Westerners, dare I say it, even anguish and anger. And I, like many others, said, well, clearly what this is the worst possible example of why Confederation does not work for this country of Canada. That one region, large Central Canada, the Maritimes, can re-elect someone like this, the highest office in the land, and to quote, govern over us. So this dismay on my part presented me with a dilemma. I think it's one that's been faced now over the last year and a half by a lot of Westerners. What to do about it? We continue to do what we've done in the past and support largely, especially across the borders, but even in rural British Columbia and parts of rural Manitoba, elect conservatives or somebody of conservative ideology, like reformers, and continue to try to educate Central and Eastern Canada why we feel they, or do we try a new route? And I came to the realization that this confederation doesn't work. There's really only two paths to travel, Nathan. One is to modernize the Constitution to ensure that the West is treated fairly. Or secondly, if that doesn't work, there's no appetite for that on the part of Central and Eastern Canadians, then it would be to chart our own course, lay the foundations for independence referendums in the Western provinces, try and convince provincial governments across the West that that's the only feasible or practical path forward for the West. And that really is what led me to stepping back out of the shadows. I was happily retired, spending time with my grandchildren. But last June, a small group of us, in fact, 8 individuals, volunteered our time to form a board. The existing leader of Wexit Canada, which had applied for registration with Elections Canada, stepped aside, and I volunteered to serve as interim leader. And as I say, these 7 individuals, some of whom were on the original board and were the original organizers of Wexit Canada, and the remainder were new people, new to the board, and they stepped forward. We volunteered to try and build an alternative for Western Canada. And so we proceeded from there. We designed and communicated a mission statement. We formulated our guiding principles for the party, and then more recently and then in there as well, we had to come to the position of developing a new name, hence Maverick. We can get into a discussion of how that came about, but that was in mid-September of last year. And then more recently, we've started organizing electoral district associations across Western Canada. We've nominated appointed a few candidates. We can talk about the process we've used for that. And then we've also recently released our draft platform, which will probably carry us into the next election, depending on when it is.
Let's talk about the next election just briefly there for a moment. Do you think we're headed into one for this spring, or do you think we're headed in for one for this fall? I guess we're at the end of spring pretty much here.
Yes, we are. We're now basically looking at a summer election if the writ was to drop. I think that in all likelihood, I've felt for quite some time the Prime Minister would like to go. I think that he believes his polls, and his internal polls probably even show he's more popular in Central and Eastern Canada than he was in the fall of 2019. I think that if he had his way, he would probably call an early election. There's a couple of things that are standing in his way. One is a bill that's before the House, and he's failed to get any support from the Conservatives to move it along through the parliamentary process. That bill would allow Elections Canada to make certain changes and in order to effectively operate a federal election during our current situation with the COVID pandemic. So that's a bit of a problem for him. And then probably more important, his ineffectiveness and inability to secure sufficient supply of vaccines for Canadians, I think has to be worrisome for him, because as we saw with the recent provincial election in Newfoundland, things could go sideways pretty quickly if we experienced, for example, over the summer, potential for a fourth wave in different provinces or indeed across the land. So that has to be of concern to him, because perhaps he would wear some of that because of the errors in judgment that we've seen from the federal government on this issue over the past year.
And I think that with what's happening with COVID and everything else, like everything's very tense, not just about the nature of the election, but what it would look like for policy. We've had a couple of COVID elections throughout the pandemic. Are those models, and do those models favor an insurgent party like yourself?
Well, I mean, I guess that's debatable. It depends on how the campaign will unfold. I mean, up until we saw a very narrow victory for the Liberals in Newfoundland, what we'd seen was a succession of governments returned to power. In fact, I think it was two of them in New Brunswick and British Columbia that went from a minority to a majority. So obviously that is what Prime Minister Trudeau would like to see happen on the national level. Saskatchewan, of course, they had a majority Sask Party government, and it was returned in overwhelming numbers because it's one of the more popular governments across the country. So I guess the bottom line there is that nobody lost. So your question about whether a early, what I would class possibly as an unnecessary election, would benefit a party like Maverick, it remains a big unknown, of course. It would be a very unusual election, as you can imagine, just as the ones were provincially, in the fact that a lot of it would be conducted via social media, just as we're conducting this this interview today, Nathan. So we really don't know how that would play out and what effect that would have on the voting public. I think that there's going to be a huge opportunity in Western Canada, obviously, for Maverick to convey our central message about the unfairness of Confederation, and about the fact that if Westerners really want true Western representation, rather than electing members of Parliament from whichever party, national party, that are going to endeavor to appease the voters in Central and Eastern Canada, they will have the opportunity, hopefully, to elect Maverick members of Parliament that will provide accurate representation.
Accurate representation. This has been an ongoing problem since your first trip to Parliament back in '93. You belonged to the class of '93, to the Reform movement, and the projects thereof. What after almost 30 years, what do you know differently now that you didn't know then? What had you hoped to do then that you've had to kind of make decisions now and policy now that's different? Or is it the same? Or did the project just not get complete?
Well, I think what is different, and I have freely admitted to talk show hosts and reporters and the media, Nathan, over the last 10 months since we started this exercise, I've freely admitted to being a slow learner. And I don't say that with a lot of pride. I believe, like a lot of reformers that started out in the mid-'80s, that we did accomplish things. There's things about my political career, the 17 years that I spent representing the people of northeastern British Columbia in Ottawa. There's things that I am quite proud of. I'm quite proud of a number of things, for example, that we accomplished with Prime Minister Harper and the Conservative government. Having said all of that, what I've come to realize and what I am trying to communicate to Westerners is that for those that are conservative-minded and believe that the country is best served by conservative governments, I'm asking them if they are getting tired of seeing in our lifetimes and in former generations in Canada this constant flip-flopping back and forth throughout our history between conservative and liberal governments. Because the reality is that whether it was Prime Minister Trudeau's father and that government, whether it was the government of Prime Minister Chrétien more recently when I was in Ottawa, and whether it's Justin Trudeau now, is that eventually, no matter how often we elect a conservative government, and we try to get from our perspective, from a Westerner's perspective, we try to get our country back on track, or what we believe is on track, then inevitably what happens is at some point Central and Eastern Canada says, whoa, West is gaining too much. Conservatives are pandering to Western Canada. We better elect a Liberal government and rein these guys in a bit. And we have to figure out, Nathan, a better way of doing government in Canada. And that's why Maverick has come up with this twin-track approach. It's our mission statement, a two-track mission statement. One is to actually try, as I said already, try to modernize Canada's constitution to treat the West fairly. And if that fails, then at the same time, well, we're not going to wait around and see if Central and Eastern Canada would agree to look at making those changes to the Constitution. We will lay the foundations for an independent West. And obviously, that's a huge task ahead of us as well. We have to convince, millions of Westerners that that's the only viable course forward. So that's where we're at, and we'll see what transpires.
It's kind of surreal, that the idea that this could all really happen. That if it is another minority government, if enough Mavericks are elected to Parliament, they could hold a balance of power, and they could ask some pretty serious things. They could demand some pretty serious changes from Ottawa, and if Ottawa won't concede, then they could also bring down the government. That's an interesting way forward. What do you think is the appetite for separation in the West? Are people still trying to keep Canada together, at least keep the borders the same, maybe change the arrangement inside, or are people starting to get ready to leave?
Well, I think that a lot of Westerners, as I've said, Nathan, recognize that Confederation is broken. It just simply doesn't work. It was put into place in the 1800s under the old model of Upper and Lower Canada, and the West has been used and abused ever since. That's not saying for a minute that we haven't benefited, all of us, from being Canadians. Of course we have. And of course, most people are still profoundly patriotic and love being Canadian and all that stands for. But having said that, I think we're way past time to modernize our Constitution to ensure that Ottawa doesn't dictate to the outer regions, in particular to Western Canada. We see that in the constant drain of financial resources through the so-called equalization formula. We see that with laws that are passed that dramatically impact on our future and the future of our children and grandchildren. Laws like the ban of oil tankers off the northern coast of the Pacific, off our British Columbia coast, when tankers come into Eastern Canada every day from countries that have far less standards for human rights, for environmental standards, for labor standards, and yet Canada, Eastern Canada imports billions of gallons of oil every year in that way. And so, the West says, well, why the discrimination? Why two different rules under Confederation? So I think that there is a growing appetite for fairness, and we've seen that manifested itself, especially on the prairies, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan. The government's calling for greater autonomy. Here in Alberta, we've had this fairly recently a fair deal panel that had traveled the province, come up with a strong list of recommendations that they made to the Alberta government that has manifested itself in, at least in some policy direction for the Jason Kenney government, to try and achieve greater autonomy on a range of issues, such as we've seen Quebec secure for itself over the years, whether it's in the area of immigration, whether it's in the area of their own police force. You can go down the list, their own pension plan. These are all things that Quebec has, and in some cases has had for years. And we're increasingly seeing, especially in Alberta, but in other provinces as well, saying, well, why don't we have that level of autonomy under Confederation? So sure, I believe that the majority of Westerners, I believe the polls are right, the majority of Westerners would love to remain Canadian if we could arrive at an arrangement where we could be treated fairly under Confederation. But right now, that's not happening. There's not an appetite for that. And I would argue that potentially the provincial governments are not moving quickly enough to see that happen. Part of that, Nathan, is that all governments across the land are consumed with this battle with this virus right now, and decisions that they feel they are forced to make in that regard. So it's thrown a lot of legislative agendas, not only in the provinces, but in Ottawa, off track, obviously.
This is an ongoing debate in the West, obviously. Are we going to stay? Are we going to go? Do we think we can get anything properly to go our way? Or are people just never going to give us a fair shake, a just shake? When it comes to selecting candidates to represent your two tracks, these are serious policy positions, more serious than have been in many years. Probably only notable exception to that would be when Trudeau really promised that there'd be the last first past the post election and marijuana would be legalized. Outside of that, there hadn't been a lot of new ideas for a while. Maybe scrapping not just the carbon tax federally, but scrapping the long gun registry. But this is a serious idea of constitutional reform, or possibly the West leaving a Wexit move. When you're looking for candidates, how do you discern which candidate would be best representing these ideas and representing the people they'll represent out west?
Well, as you can guess from the perspective of a new political party in our infancy, as I say, we're only 10 months old since we began this exercise at the end of June. In fact, we're just over 7 months old as the Maverick Party. So we're still in a very early stages of evolution. But we have put in what we believe a very robust, somewhat onerous candidate selection process to try and ensure that we have the best candidates possible heading into the next election campaign. We've had, I'm going to just guess, and I might not be completely up to speed on this because I'm not directly involved in the candidate selection process, but we've had somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 plus people that have applied to become candidates for Maverick. Many of them have gone through a process that involves a couple of different questionnaires. The first is a fairly brief one, just so that the selection committee can get to know them a little bit. Then I believe it's 30-page questionnaire goes out to them that involves things like criminal record checks and financial information. Obviously, a lot of things that they have to be comfortable that it's going to be kept confidential, but that needs to be shared with our committee. The party has asked 3 volunteers to sit on our committee. It's chaired by a former member of parliament, colleague of mine, Val Meredith. Her name now is Val Fraser. She's relocated from the lower mainland of British Columbia to Calgary, so she lives not far from me here in Calgary. My deputy leader for Maverick Party is a fellow out of Saskatchewan, a farmer rancher named of Alan Kirpan. And he was a former colleague as well for 2 terms in Ottawa. And then he went on to serve a couple of terms with Brad Wall as a Sask Party MLA in Saskatchewan. And the third member of our candidate selection committee is a former colleague, long-serving member of Parliament, Leon Benoit from Northern Alberta. The reason why I asked 3 former colleagues is because between the 3 of them, they have an incredible amount of experience as a politician. And I felt that they would be ideally experienced to conduct the process that culminated with interviews with prospective candidates, make the candidate, the nominee to be a candidate at least, well aware of what they were getting into, because unfortunately, Nathan, all too many people really don't understand the job of a member of parliament and what it entails, the stresses and pressures it puts on not only the individual, but by extension, their spouses and their family, their children. And so who better than Val, Alan, and Leon to convey that to them and to ask the probing questions to try to ensure that they're well prepared and that they are ideally situated to be a candidate for Maverick. So that gives you some idea of the process that we're going through in selection of our candidates. We've also, at this point, targeted 40 plus ridings across Western Canada in relation to this whole fear of vote splitting. And I can explain that in some detail if you would like, but suffice it to say that these are ridings where the Conservatives won by incredibly large margins. And so people saying, well, why would you vote Maverick? Because you're going to simply split the vote and allow the Liberals to win. Well, we say a couple of things to that. One is that we're not running in Central and Eastern Canada. Maverick Party is going to be a true Western party. We're going to remain a Western party. We're only going to run in Western Canada. So there won't be any vote splitting at all, or at least not caused by Maverick in Central and Eastern Canada. So that eliminates about 2/3 of the ridings in Canada. And then where we will be riding in Western Canada, for this first time around, we're targeting where Conservatives won by, as I say, very wide margins, where if you split the vote that the Conservative candidate got in the last election or two, straight down the middle, even half and half between a Maverick and a Conservative, the people of those constituencies are going to send either a Conservative, yet again, back to Ottawa, or they'll send a Maverick. So there's not going to be any chance of sending a Liberal, NDP, or Green candidate and effectively vote splitting as the Conservatives are trying to suggest. So that's sort of a recapitulation of how we're managing our candidate selection process.
Yeah, it is. And that's very helpful. Very helpful. With representation, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is that selecting a candidate isn't easy. And it's not easy because we live in a time of extreme political correctness. Being a new party means new ideas that might sound radical. It might sound to some people dangerous, not to me, but people will castigate it that way or try to cast aspersions on it that way. How do you find that line between having the guy who can authentically represent his local riding while still trying to make sure that the party's electable?
Well, that's an excellent question, Nathan, and it's something I think that not only Maverick, but all parties struggle with when they're selecting their candidates and trying to, quote, keep them on message. What we're endeavoring to do is to convince our candidates and by extension the public that we have a huge job ahead of us on either one of our twin track approaches. Whether it's to convince the other provinces outside of Western Canada to support substantive modernization of the Constitution and educate them as to why that's necessary for Western Canada and for us, to try and build a promising future for future generations of Westerners. Or whether it's the second approach of laying the foundations of an independent West and to start out down that path by electing Maverick members of Parliament to truly represent Western Canadian interests. That both of those are huge jobs, and I think that most Canadians, if they take the time to look at that, they would understand that. And so what we're saying, Nathan, and we're trying to make sure our candidates stay on this message line and don't get too distracted with other issues, is that we must stay focused on those big goals and objectives, because in order to have any chance of achieving them, we have to rally sufficient Westerners to that cause. And we're not going to get there if we get mired in, what is this new country going to look like? Or, will we be a monarchy or a republic? or all of these other myriad issues that would deal with independence, as you're suggesting. So we simply must have candidates that commit to the Maverick message and our goals and objectives, and that will try their best when they're under the stress and pressures of a campaign to stay on that message and not be distracted by all of these other issues, no matter how important they might be to either a segment of our Western population or the individual that's posing the question. I'm not suggesting for a minute that all of us don't have issues that are near and dear to our hearts. And we're getting this a lot in the last 2 weeks since we released our draft policies. Of course, people are coming forward and saying, well, what about this or that or the next thing that's not in your policies? And so what we're trying to say, Nathan, is, look, I mean, A, this party's in its infancy. B, we developed this policy platform to try and give an overall view of where we're headed and what we stand for. And if you're going to vote for Maverick, what that means to you and should mean to you. And, that we're trying our best to stay on message and keep our representatives on message.
Staying on message is always it's always a difficult task, a couple of different ways. Maybe something that needs to kind of be sussed out a little bit more is again the reaction of the media, because so much of electoral politics is media. We are happy, of course, to have you here. I'm very happy to be on the Western Standard and to have this platform and to be speaking to people like yourself and other people who may not get as nice of a hearing elsewhere or be outright canceled by other platforms and other companies. What has it been like in the media? Have you been able to kind of give your message, or have they been interpreting it, the mainstream media, has it been interpreting it wrongly?
Well, I would say that the so-called mainstream media, especially in connection with what we commonly view as national media, has been fair in their reporting when we have had the opportunity to present our message, whether it's myself or anybody else speaking on behalf of Maverick. I can't complain that they have tried to, disguise our message or attack us unfairly or anything like that. I think the biggest problem that we've had is gaining a level of credibility whereby the media will actually start paying some attention to us. With the exception of Western Standard and some of the newspapers and television and radio in Western Canada, we've had very little success in penetrating what you would call the mainstream media out of Toronto and Ottawa. It is coming. We've had some recent successes where we've had some good stories with Central Canadian media. I mean, I suppose to some extent it's not unusual that they choose to ignore us by and large because we're new, we're an upstart, and we're easily labeled as a fringe party as we've tried to get this going because we don't have a large membership base, and we're just starting to nominate candidates, and so it's easy for them, as I say, to ignore. We're not running in Central and Eastern Canada, so we've eliminated 2/3 of the ridings in the countries by making that our choice. But I think the direct answer to your question is that I would have to say that from my experience as a longtime politician, that all the media that have interviewed me have been actually very fair and just asked upfront questions about the party. And I've certainly appreciated that. And I think all of our supporters and members have appreciated that fact, that they've given us sort of a clean microphone, if you will, to get our message out.
Well, that's fair. That's fair. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, at a fundamental level, we've had serious constitutional questions in this country for a long time, and it makes no sense that anybody should get panned for that. I know that there were times where, particularly in Quebec, the reform movement got some short shrift by various reporters. I've heard stories of that. But I'm glad that this time around, at least so far, some respect is being paid and the democratic ethic is being honored. With respect to that, then, the democratic ethic, what is your hope then with the upcoming election? If it is going to be a COVID election and there's going to be a new sort of system to ensure that people have social distancing and everything else, how does one campaign when you can't even get door to door, or maybe you can? I'm not sure what that's all about.
Well, those are excellent questions, Nathan. I think that from what I've heard from some of our supporters that are actually door knocking as we speak, there are ways to do it and do it safely. Obviously, out of respect for the homeowners, the folks that are doing this for Maverick are wearing masks. Even if they don't personally believe that a mask accomplishes a lot, they wear a mask out of respect for the folks that are going to answer the door. And when the person comes to the door, the person doing the door knocking takes a step back, perhaps steps down a couple steps off of the porch, and has some social distance as they have a conversation about what is this Maverick all about. And so I think that there are ways in which, even under a COVID type restrictions, that we could have at least partially a normal, if I can call it that, election campaign when it comes to door knocking, at least. Where the difficulty is, of course, is the restrictions. If they were under our current conditions, we wouldn't be allowed to hold meetings and rallies of any size. And that would be quite different than, especially for the leaders' tours. I mean, where we're accustomed to seeing these large rallies, where a leader will fly into a certain city and it's all pre-orchestrated. Maybe that's a good thing, that we wouldn't be allowed to hold those things and get back to the most basic types of campaigns where people would have to carry the message more one-on-one, sort of eyeball to eyeball, rather than these large orchestrated PR events that we're used to in the past. I don't know. We'll have to see. As I say, part of the problem for the Prime Minister, if he wants to call an early election, is that Elections Canada doesn't have the flexibility, this is my understanding at least, the legal flexibility to bring in some of the changes, for example, to have much more of the electorate make use of mail-in ballots. I know one of the things that apparently is in this bill that the Liberals have put before Parliament is to have a 3-day voting time period, as opposed to traditionally we just have the 1 day with a few advanced polling days. So they need some flexibility, they being Elections Canada, to hold an election under these types of conditions that will still allow the vast majority of Canadians the right to exercise their democratic right and cast a ballot. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. I don't think that anybody would think that it's not going to be quite different if it's held before sufficient people get vaccinated, and hopefully we can put this virus business behind us, or at least get it down to where it's more like an annual flu shot, which, of course, I think everyone, no matter what side of the debate they're on, would agree with that that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, it's I'm just thinking of all that. I mean, there was a lot of things that came out of the most recent American election when it came to mail-in voting. I don't want to entertain any of that here, relitigate it. It's a lot to get into. But nonetheless, if there is one thing to say about America versus Canada, and this is something that's not understood very well by Canadian electors, is that in America, you can pretty much vote by bingo card, carrier pigeon, or one-armed bandit. It looks that diverse. There are punch cards, there are hanging chads, as it were, and of course there's digital voting as well. You can press buttons on a screen for digital voting because their ballots are much larger than ours. But nonetheless, the mail-in voting question in the United States was quite controversial and remains quite controversial. In Canada, I think it'll have more integrity, but even so, with those kind of doubts swarming around, if an election is held in the fall, I can tell you that I personally will find a way to vote in person. That's very important to me, and I would encourage everyone else to do the same as far as they are able. When we're going into this question of the election itself, of course, the writ's going to have to be dropped by somebody who isn't the Governor General, because, of course, we don't have one anymore. When we're getting another one, I'm not sure, but we don't have one right now. So apparently it's going to be the Chief Justice or the former Chief Justice, perhaps Beverly McLaughlin herself. That would be interesting. But as we kind of move into this new mode of Canada, we've had the pandemic for a while. Debt is climbing. The questions of separation and sovereignty, yes, they are important to many people, but a lot of them also are taking a bit of a backseat to the question of the economy. What is the Maverick answer to what are we going to do with all this debt, and how are we going to get out of the COVID crunch that we're feeling?
Well, I think that it's obvious to most Western Canadians that have some modicum of common sense that we cannot continue to go the way we are. I made one of my leaders' video shortly after the budget came out to express my concern on behalf of my grandchildren about this horrendous accumulation of debt. If the numbers are to be believed, and we have to question them, that we're headed to $1.4 trillion of debt. And the biggest concern over and above the amount of money that's been shoveled out the door by Mr. Trudeau and his government is the unaccountability of it. I mean, there's a story almost every week about how they cannot account for billions upon billions of dollars. And that is extremely worrisome for me, Nathan, as someone that really has been proud to describe myself as a fiscal conservative. Indeed, when I left the farm in the mid-'80s to run for the Reform Party, it was largely out of concern of the runaway debt at the time. I was quite proud to be part of the Reform Party in that initial tranche of 52 reformers elected in '93 that put pressure on Jean Chrétien and our finance minister at the time, Paul Martin. And I give them full marks for responding to the pressure of reformers in the House of Commons and making some hard decisions. I mean, they didn't balance the budget the way Reform would have, but they did make a lot of changes that were necessary to get Canada back on a solid fiscal foundation. And good on them. I've often remarked, Nathan, that in the last while, I don't understand why Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien aren't outspoken about what is happening to their fiscal legacy. It's sad that the two of them, primarily as leading the Liberal government for those three successive majority governments, and the steps they took and the heat they took from, shall we say, the left in Canada, that didn't believe in the cuts they were making in order to get back to balanced budgets and indeed start to run surpluses and begin to pay down debt. And now to see what Justin Trudeau has done to the financial viability of Canada and future generations. I mean, if anybody over and above us old reformers should be just aghast at what has happened, it should be Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Martin. So where do we go from here? I would like to see a plan, obviously put forward by a federal government, whether it's Liberal or Conservative, that clearly lays out how they are going to stimulate the economy, not through spending billions of dollars that we don't have, but by supporting the private sector. And I cannot understand why there's this open warfare against the largest generator of economic activity and income for a federal government, which is our oil and gas industry that has sustained not just Quebec and the Maritimes, but indeed all of Canada for quite some years now. Why there's this open warfare on the part of the Liberals in regulation, in carbon tax, you run down the list. They are driving the investors away at the very time when we need international investment in our oil and gas sector to fuel the upcoming hoped-for recovery. I don't understand this, Nathan, and I don't think most Westerners do. And that's why increasingly we are rebelling against the policies of Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government.
I think there's lots of speculation that can be had from outright, who's paying who to, the Tides Foundation. I had Vivian Krause on a program that I used to do called Prince George Up Close, because of course I'm calling you from, or we're talking to each other. You're in Alberta, I'm in the BC's northern capital, Prince George. Part of your old riding. I used to live on your side of the river. And I think that ultimately, I mean, it doesn't matter which way you kind of turn it all around, especially with the way Vivian was talking about it and how she explained how there really is a large organization attempting to take these things out. She saw it first when it came to salmon fishing, salmon farming in the west coast of BC. She's no one's idea of a conspiracy theorist. She worked for the UN for 20 years. She's great. I hope to have her on the program in the not too distant future. But to your point that there's this open warfare on Alberta oil and an open war on the West, to the point where the Trudeau government really does seem to take delight in seeing the West suffer. I fundamentally believe that it comes back to the same point that you were making about Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien. Why aren't they criticizing their own people? Well, because they're the de facto they're the de facto ruling party of Canada. They are the default ruling party of Canada. They're the natural governing ruling party of Canada. So they can't commit the sins that others can. They just can't. They're part of the elect. They are perfect. They are blameless, and they must be defended at all costs. And I think that we can see this in the United States as well on the left, where there are plenty of places where Joe Biden is criticizing even Obama. He was his vice president, for goodness sake. And yet there's no consternation between Bill, Obama, and Biden. They're all on the same side. They're all fighting the same way because it's all about control. It's all about power. It's not about the people anymore. When it comes to Canada, maybe that's exactly a place to kind of bring this all to a conclusion, Jay. If this is about the people and bringing power back to the people, what would you propose? Someone says, look, Ottawa, Victoria, Calgary, Edmonton, I don't care where it is. They have too much control in my life. How are you going to bring power back to the people?
Well, as I said, Nathan, you've summarized the situation on the political front very well there. I think that people increasingly in Western Canada, at least, recognize that, as I said earlier, the system simply doesn't work. I've taken to referring to it as the tyranny of the majority. And when I say that, people say, well, does that mean that you don't support democracy, as in one person, one vote? And I say, no, that's fine. But in a supposed bicameral system, people have to understand that really in Canada, we've always just had a unicameral in the sense that it's the majority in the House of Commons that dictates the policies of the country. And what ends up happening is because there's no check and balance the way they have in the United States or Australia, where they have an elected equal upper Senate, upper House in their system. We don't have that in Canada. And so that's why I refer to it as tyranny of the majority. And the fact that every majority government or every national government, whether it's conservative or liberal, has to attempt to appease where the votes are and where the majority of the seats are, which is central Canada. And, people have referred to this, it's that huge corridor that runs from Windsor to Quebec City and encompasses Mississauga and Toronto and Montreal and even out as far as Ottawa. So that's where the majority of the people in Canada reside. And that's fine that those people, under our democracy would control the lower house. But we have to have a safeguard in the form of a Senate that would oversee any discrimination that might be passed by the lower chamber. And we don't. Instead, we've got a rubber stamp. We've got an ineffective. We've got an unequal Senate. The majority of the seats for the Senate as well are in central and eastern Canada. They have far more representation in both houses than they deserve. We have a ridiculous situation, because of the archaic constitution we live under, where Prince Edward Island has 4 members of parliament for 130,000 people. We have other ridings in Ontario and in the West where you got almost that many people in one riding. So they have arguably, 3 to 4 times the representation in the lower house. And then they have 4 senators as well. in the upper chamber. So that's why Maverick is saying that we need to change the way in which we're governed if we're ever going to have fairness, respect, equity in how Western Canada is treated. And if we're ever going to get some control of our own destiny and not just give that right because of a constitution designed in the 1800s, give that right to central Canada. So
as we come to the end of our time here, we're going
to
have to break at about 10:55 Pacific, 11:55 Mountain, because that's when it goes on to the pipeline every Wednesday out of the Western Standard in Calgary. But as we had a few last minutes here, Jay, somebody wants to get involved, they want to join the party, they want to be a part of the party and be a part of the movement. How do they do that, and what would that look like for their role?
Well, we would urge them foremost, Nathan, to go to our website at www.maverickparty.ca. So it's pretty easy to access. As I say, we've got our twin track mission statement up there. We have our 8 guiding principles. We have our 5 proposed constitutional amendments under our track A, modernizing Canada's constitution. They're easy to understand, and they clearly show where Maverick Party believes that we could get the fairness that we're seeking and stay within Canada and within Confederation, but developed a lot more autonomy for Western provinces and Western people. And then over and above that, more recently, we have on there our policies and our upcoming platform. So a lot of information there for them. They can take out a membership. It's just $10 and become a member. And then we have biweekly newsletters that go out to our members. And so they would be kept apprised of the ongoing development of the party. They have the opportunity there to apply to be a candidate if they so choose, to get involved in forming a local electoral district association. So it's all there. We welcome all people. If you look at our guiding principles, the party is open to one and all in Western Canada that want to put their shoulder to the wheel, come out of the shadows, and are brave enough to step forward and become Mavericks. And hence the name. We designed the name to really exemplify Westerners that are willing to take a risk to try and change the system. And we've had Mavericks worldwide down through history, people that are quite willing to take the risk and break the molds, as it were, in their chosen profession. They come from all walks of life in all countries. And we figure that it exemplifies what we need to do if we're going to change the way the West is treated.
Yeah, I believe it was once put that government by the people, of the people, and for the people would not cease to exist from this earth. So hopefully your party will be instrumental to reinstating that in Canada, because we're in desperate need of it. I've been speaking with Jay Hill, leader of the Maverick Party, of course the former member for Prince George Peace River, now Prince George Peace River in Northern Rockies. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Nathan. Thanks for having me on your program.
There, we have the pipeline coming down in just a few minutes. That will be out in Calgary there. And so our friends in Calgary will be bringing that on at noon. Again, I wanted to say thank you for everyone who tuned in today. And as always, do send me a message. Do suggest guests. Do suggest anybody and everybody that you'd think should be brought on the show. The email's right there. We're still practicing the hand draw thing. I have to learn how to do that because I've never really done TV before in this way, not live anyways, and not with a green screen. So someday I'll learn how to do the weather. Don't you worry. But in any case, do send anything and everything, and do suggest guests, and that way we can bring people on and discuss the things you want us to discuss. So thanks again. That was Mountain Standard Time. We'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain.